or good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're listening to this. I look forward to bringing to you today and continuing our series on victory, living victoriously, the victorious church. And it's been great the last 2 weeks how we've been looking at different aspects that we serve, and we follow a God of the reversal in any situation and circumstances, bringing on so many occasions, in so many different ways, in individual lives, in grand circumstances, bringing victory from defeat and turning joy from grief, and bringing happiness into sorrow. And how we've looked at, in Jesus we have that victory. The victory has already been won, and in a sense it is for us individually to make a choice, to make a clear decision that we will walk and we will live in that victory. And as I've been reflecting on what Adrian and Nathan has been bringing us over the last couple of weeks, I really felt drawn to John chapter 16, where we really see this summed up so clearly and so well. John chapter 16, starting from verse 17, is where we read of how the disciples' grief will turn to joy. And it's at this point in Jesus' ministry that he's telling his closest followers, the apostles, that in a little while he will no longer be around. But then there will be a short time when he's no longer around, and then he will be back. And the disciples were very confused about what Jesus was saying, what Jesus was meaning about this. And he says in verse 20, I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and your time of grief will turn to rejoicing, and no one will take away your joy. And then he goes on to properly explain what he's meaning by there will be a time when he's going to be going away and then coming back, and the disciples finally understand. And then Jesus says in verse 31, you believe at last. Jesus answered, but a time is coming and has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home. You will leave me all alone, yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. And in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. He says at the end of that, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. It's such an encouraging passage for a very uncertain time in Jesus' ministry as he's going into the crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection. But for him to be so clear, so certain in his statements that he has overcome the world. And today I really wanted to focus and look at this in the context of church history. Now, when I say the first church history, I implore you not to turn this off and to persevere, to just give me the next 20 minutes or so, because the church history, our church history, is something to be engaged with, something to certainly explore and to unpack, because it's our church history. It binds us together as believers, as followers of Christ, as brothers and sisters in him. It is our history, regardless of our background, of our race, of our nationality. It is a history that is shared among all believers and does indeed bind us together. It is a history over millennia of God's providence, of God's protection, of God's sovereignty, of God's continued victory. And it's a history that, for many of us today, we may be grappling with particular questions, particular challenges. And actually, when you explore and when you dig into church history, those answers may have already been found, centuries ago by others. So, in the context of our victorious church that has been standing for many, many years, I wanted to bring into the conversation 2 or 3 particular lives and particular experiences and passages of time, especially in the early church. So we start in AD 69 with a guy called Polycarp. So this is a time when Jesus has obviously ascended, and a lot of the apostles at the birth of Polycarp are of course still around. And Polycarp sat at the feet of the Apostle John. So the apostle that Jesus loved, the writer of the Gospel of John, Polycarp was one of John's own followers, learnt his theology, a lot of his development, Christian maturity and development was through the teaching and through the life and the work of the Apostle John. And Polycarp led the church in Smyrna, and guys like Polycarp, at this time, he lived from 69 AD to 155 AD. At this time, guys like Polycarp were really, really important. Because obviously, as we get further into the first century, the first-hand witnesses, the apostles, the disciples, the first followers of Jesus were obviously dying as the first century went along. So you had guys like Polycarp who were, for want of a better expression, the next best thing. They were second-hand witnesses. So John himself may have died, but you had Polycarp who sat at the feet of John. So he was very close to understanding, even at that time, in a similar way as John did. But at this time, as many of us know, in the first century AD, was a time of great persecution against Christians. The church that Polycarp led, before Polycarp himself was captured, had 11 martyrs just in that one church. And it came to a time where Polycarp was 86, and the spotlight of Rome was on his shoulders, and Polycarp fled and hid out in a farmhouse. And in this farmhouse there was 2 slave boys, and the Roman soldiers came and tortured these 2 slave boys. And one of them held firm, held his tongue, the other gave up Polycarp's hiding place. And we read in a number of letters that the church in Smyrna wrote to actually encourage the surrounding churches quite a lot about the series of events that followed. We read that Polycarp actually, when he saw the Roman soldiers come into his hiding place, invited them in, broke bread with them, prayed and offered to pray for them. But after a couple of hours, they took him to the local magistrate. And the magistrate of the region was a wily operator. He knew that this wasn't great PR for the Roman Empire. This wasn't great to make an 86-year-old man a martyr, to be, throwing him into the lion's den or burning him at the stake. So the magistrate really wanted to give Polycarp an out. So he said to Polycarp, look, just renounce Christ in front of me, allege yourself to Caesar, and we'll let you go, and we'll say no more. And Polycarp's response was this: 86 years have I served Christ, nor has he ever done me any harm. How then could I blaspheme my King who saved me? You threaten the fire that burns for an hour and then is quenched, but you know not of the fire of the judgment to come, and the fire of eternal punishment. Bring what you will. It was very defying. Bring it on. And the magistrate came back with another compromise. Said, okay, look, you don't have to renounce Christ, but can you just swear in the name of the seat of Caesar? Can you just give allegiance to the name? Can you just give some deference to his authority? But Polycarp stayed firm. and for that he was burnt at the stake. And interestingly and miraculously actually, the witnesses that recorded his martyrdom said that as it happened, a sweet smell entered the air of freshly baked bread. But what's really interesting is when we look at and read the response that the church had to Polycarp's death. You know, it's really hard not to overestimate or over-exaggerate the importance of people like Polycarp at that time. As I said, really important as second-hand witnesses to the continued growth and flourishing of the early church. But when we read now of the letter that Smyrna sent to encourage other churches, it's really telling. We read near the end of this letter, which was part obituary of Polycarp and part testimony of his martyrdom. We read, "Later we collected up his bones, more precious than jewels and better than purified gold, and put them in an appropriate place where, the Lord willing, we shall celebrate the birthday of his martyrdom each year with joy and rejoicing, both to remember those who have run their race and to prepare those yet to walk in their steps." This is the story of the blessed Polycarp, the 12th martyr in Smyrna. Though he has a unique place in the memory of all people, being remembered even by all the heathen, he was not merely an illustrious teacher, but also a preeminent martyr whose death all desire to imitate, being altogether consistent with the gospel of Christ. Having overcome the unjust governor with patience and acquired the crown of immortality, he now, with the apostles and all the righteous, glorifies God, the Father, with joy, and blesses our Lord Jesus Christ, the Saviour of our souls, the ruler of our bodies, and the shepherd of the Catholic Church throughout the world. This letter they sent out, it's not a letter of sorrow, really. It's not a letter of despair. It's not a letter of defeat. It's not a message of, okay, we're just going to grit our teeth and just get through this really difficult time. It's a letter of victory. It's a letter of celebration. It's a letter that upholds who God is, who Jesus is. It's a letter that is looking forward, that is looking in continual obedience to walk in victory. It is a letter that is proclaiming what we read in John 16, that although the world will give you trouble, the world is there to be overcome because Jesus has overcome it. It is a letter of victory. We then move a couple of centuries to the end part of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century. And at that time, the emperor of Rome was a guy called Diocletian. And at this time, Rome was predominantly split between east and west for the empire, but there was great disunity. And one of Diocletian's main goals was to bring unity in different areas of the empire. And as we've seen throughout history, one of the ways that many leaders have used what they've done to bring unity is to point fingers at particular people groups, people of particular nationality or faith or whatever it may be, and be labelling them as they're the reason for your problems, for the reasons why we're in the state that we are as an empire or even as a country. And in that, finger pointing brings unity. So Diocletian was using that method, and for a period from 303 AD, for 8 years, came the most intense and systematic persecution of Christians arguably ever recorded, in its breadth and its scope, in the way that it was pretty systematic in its approach. And we read from Eusebius, who was a 4th century bishop and one of the first church historians. We read this short account that it was the 19th year of Diocletian's reign, which was 303 AD, and it was the month of March, and the festival of the Saviour's Passion was approaching, when an imperial decree was published everywhere, ordering the churches to be razed to the ground, and the scriptures destroyed by fire, and giving notice that those in places of honour would lose those places, and domestic staff, if they continued to profess Christianity, would be deprived of their liberty. Such was the first edict against us. Soon afterwards, other degrees arrived in rapid succession, ordering that the presidents of the churches in every place should all be first committed to prison and then coerced by every possible means into offering sacrifice. And church leaders at the time had many different responses. We read accounts from Eusebius and other historians of entire churches being led by their priests or even by their bishops to the pious, to burn the scriptures, to burn the church artefacts. The entire churches were led by their leaders to renounce Christ and to burn the Holy Book. But of course there were many, many more that defied these edicts and still professed their Christian faith and were obviously punished for it. Two particular accounts that were quite striking in actually turning the public perception within Rome against this persecution. We read there was a deacon called Timothy who lived in North Africa, and he was captured and he was tortured to reveal the hidden places of where they had hid the scriptures and the church artefacts. And he actually allowed his eyes to be put out with red hot irons. And his wife was brought in. He'd been married 3 weeks. He was 3 weeks married. And they found his wife. And they brought his wife in and said to her, look, just go and persuade him just to renounce Christ. Go in, persuade him to renounce Christ, and we can just let you two leave. And she went in intent to do so, to go in to convince her husband of 3 weeks just to renounce Christ so they could both leave and be free. But quite quickly, her resolve to do that dwindled, and she became emboldened in her own faith. Timothy, his example, his words emboldened her own faith, and she stood next to him, and they were, after moments of torture, they were both crucified. We read of also a girl called Agnes. She was 13 years old, and she came from a well-to-do family in the Roman region. And many suitors, she was recorded to be very beautiful, many suitors came to try and wed her, and she refused them. And one of the suitors was very put out by this, so he told the Roman authorities that she was a practicing Christian. So they went to her house, they took her, they flung her in front of Roman idols and told her, bow down and worship them. But she refused. She made the sign of the cross in front of these idols, and that just enraged the authorities even further. She was tortured, she was humiliated in many different ways, and actually in the end beheaded. And it was actually her martyrdom that really shook the mob, the public opinion in Rome. Here was a good Roman girl from a good family, and actually when matching against Roman morality and Roman standards, she wasn't doing anything wrong in rejecting these suitors. And it just showed at that time, as we get towards the year 311, that this persecution of Christians had reached a fever pitch. It had become manic. It had become the point of craziness in this blind zeal that certain Roman leaders had in persecuting the Christians. Now, there are many other accounts in this time between 303 and 311. But ultimately, the church was victorious. 8 years after, in the year 311, Diocletian himself issued an edict of toleration. The church had won through. But at what cost? Because you had now then a church of quite differing people. You had many churches that had just fallen by the wayside, new churches, new congregations having to come together. And as these new congregations were coming together, you would have had people, and it's not out of the realms of imagination or exaggeration, sitting in the same pew, sitting in the same line of the church, a family whose church leader very early on in the persecution had led them to renounce Christ and had now come back, sitting next maybe to a man whose wife had refused to renounce Christ and had been crucified, sitting next to a couple who had been maimed, maybe their eyes put out like Timothy, because they refused to give up the hiding places of their particular church. Where could reconciliation come from? In the natural, in the human nature inside of, for people to congregate, to come together as a church body, when they had, for some, lost loved ones. Others had been on the run or homeless for 8 years, who had maybe been maimed themselves, coming together with others who had renounced Christ quite early on, being absolutely fine, and now coming back into the church family. But what we know, for one very strong reason, is that there was reconciliation. That the churches, not just in pockets, but widespread, the response, the decision was to reconcile, was to bring forgiveness, to bring unity. They chose, in such a desperate time, they chose to live victoriously in reconciliation. And the reason why we can be so sure of this is because very shortly after, mere decades after, Rome became a Christian state, and we had the first Christian emperor in Constantine. And one of the main reasons why that happened was because of the overwhelming strength and growth and flourishing of the Christian church, which would have only happened because people in their multitudes made the same decision. That this would not break us, this would not bring defeat, this would not bring division, this would bring unity, reconciliation, forgiveness, and ultimately victory for the church and the church family. Now, lastly, I just want to look at the life of Augustine, who may be a name familiar to many of us. Augustine was born to a lady called Monica, and Monica was converted to Christianity by her nanny, basically. And Monica married a non-Christian, and she converted him. Such was her zeal and desire. We just know of Monica, her desire for anyone that she met to become a Christian, especially her family. And she desired that her children would know Christ. And Augustine was a gifted boy, intellectually gifted, but quite quickly she knew she had a battle on her hands. Augustine was a great thinker, became a professor in a university, but he was drawn away by the pleasures of the world and wanted to experience all the world had to offer. He fathered a child with a woman who wasn't his wife. And what we read is Monica was persistent. Monica would follow him everywhere. And he tried to escape. He tried to move to Milan to escape her. He took a professor post at a university in Italy, in Milan. And Monica, his mum, followed him. She followed him, she continued to hound him for Christ. And eventually we read that Augustine met the Bishop Ambrose, who was the Bishop of Milan. And Augustine and Ambrose struck a good friendship intellectually and personally, and Augustine came to Christ. And we actually read, when Monica died at 56, Augustine said, as he was grieving, "Now gone from my sight, who for years she had wept over me, that I might live in God's sight." And she died a happy woman with her prayers answered, that her son and her other family members had come to Christ. But Augustine made a choice. He desired the pleasures of the world, and he desired intellectual greatness and notoriety. And in part, when he first became a Christian, he desired something similar. He desired a quiet life, a monastic life, a life that he could devote himself to theology and become a great Christian theologian, which, of course, he did. But initially, it looked very different in the approach that Augustine had in mind. Quite individualistic, not really blessing maybe lots of other people in his life and in his times. But when he moved back to North Africa, he, as I said, wanted a quiet life, but people naturally gravitated towards him, and they petitioned him to become a priest, and quite quickly after, a bishop, the Bishop of Hippo. And for 38 years, Augustine faithfully ministered to thousands of people. He sold his goods to help the poor. He devoted himself to their service. He sent numerous letters across the Christian church, to the Christian world, petitioned Augustine for advice, for counsel, for guidance. He would often preach 5 days in a row, sometimes twice a day. And he wrote over 1,000 papers on almost every subject, touching on all important principles of Christianity. And the Christian world knew of him as the person for great counsel, great guidance. But Augustine had made that choice to give 38 years of his life in faithful service to others. That he wasn't just going to live his Christian life quietly, to live it for his own, to satisfy his own intellectual curiosity, or to attain a position that made him feel good. But he made a choice to live an abundant, victorious life for others, to bless others, to serve others, to give counsel and guidance to others. So I'll just leave you with this. Church history, may not be for everybody, but I encourage you to engage with church history. As I said, it is our shared history that binds us together. And it is one where if you're grappling with questions and challenges, you can indeed find answers in the faithful lives of those that have come before us. I'd encourage you to look, as we look through some of these examples through church history, that it is such encouraging examples of where victory will be found. That Jesus has overcome the world, and in such desperate circumstances, the death of Polycarp, the persecution under Diocletian, that we are encouraged that victory has been assured, and it is our choice, maybe daily, our choice to walk victoriously. And I implore you to be empowered to live for others. Regardless of whether you're a brand new Christian or been a Christian for decades, like Augustine, who may have desired just a quiet, humble, simple Christian life, to get on with reading his Bible and to be praying into things, I implore you to be empowered to live victoriously for others, to see where you can be a blessing to others, in whatever small way that may look. Be encouraged with church history, be encouraged by the examples we see in victory, and be encouraged to bless those around you. Amen.